On the evening of November 16th, 2013, 57-year-old Nancy Pfister stood in front of a crowded room of party guests inside of her house in Aspen, Colorado. Nancy held up a bottle of expensive champagne and called out to get everyone's attention. Her guests turned and watched their host like she was a queen holding court. Nancy had blonde hair and blue eyes and looked like she could have been a model. She told the crowd that she was going to skip winter in the mountains of Colorado and head to the warm beaches of Australia, and she could not think of a better way to spend her last night in town than hanging out with all the people she loved. Nancy thanked everyone for coming, popped open the champagne, and told her guests to have fun. Music began to play, and the guests cheered, and then they all kind of began circulating through Nancy's massive house that sat on over 35 acres of land. And they could look out through these huge floor-to-ceiling windows to get an incredible view of Nancy's property that was covered in aspen trees and surrounded by the snow-capped Rocky Mountains. A lot of Nancy's friends were some of the wealthiest people in Aspen, which was known as one of the wealthiest cities in America, so this was saying something. But the view from Nancy's house was so spectacular, it still made all of her friends a bit jealous. Nancy poured herself a glass of champagne, took a sip, and looked out at everyone with a huge grin on her face. Hosting parties was one of her favorite things to do. In fact, over the decades, Nancy's parties had become sort of legendary. Nancy had inherited millions of dollars and part of the successful ski resort her parents had owned. So Nancy had always had money, and she had always played hostess to the rich and famous who vacationed in Aspen. She had also been briefly engaged to the actor Michael Douglas, she was still good friends with the very famous actor Jack Nicholson, and she'd even hung out with the Dalai Lama. She was also known to have regularly gotten drunk with Hunter S. Thompson, the very famous author of Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, who had unfortunately taken his own life, actually not far from Aspen, back in 2005. Nancy walked through the large open front room of her house and began to mingle with some of her guests. But she had her eye on a particular couple that was sitting on the couch. Nancy waved to them, and their faces lit up. Dr. Trey Styler and his wife were in their 60s, but Trey had been dealing with some pretty serious health issues, so he actually looked 10 years older than he was. He often had trouble standing, and walking for long periods of time was a big challenge, but he still had a sharp mind and an amazing sense of humor, which is actually why Nancy liked him so much. She thought he was really funny. Nancy walked over to Trey and his wife, who also happened to be named Nancy, and she sat down next to them on the couch, and then she asked them how they were enjoying the party. They said they were having a great time, but admittedly, they were already plotting how to clean up the house afterwards, and Nancy smiled and laughed. When Nancy had made her plans to travel to Australia, the Stylers had been looking for a new home in the area, and when Nancy found out about it, she suggested they put that off and just rent her place while she was gone. And she actually said they could just move in right away if they wanted to, that way the house would feel more like a home when they were actually on their own. The Stylers had jumped at the chance, they loved Nancy's house like everybody did, and they always had a great time with Nancy, so the three of them had basically been roommates for the last several weeks, and as much as Nancy was looking forward to traveling in Australia, she was going to miss spending time with the Stylers. And Trey and his wife felt the same way. Trey had been a very successful anesthesiologist before his health forced him to retire, but like Nancy, he had inherited a lot of money, so the two of them shared similar backgrounds and seemed to really connect with each other. Nancy was still talking to the Stylers when she heard someone calling her name. She glanced up and saw her friend Kathy Carpenter was standing there looking totally panicked. Kathy told Nancy that she really needed to talk to her right now. Nancy told Trey and his wife she'd catch up with them later, and then she stood up and walked with Kathy to a secluded corner of the room. Other guests watched as Nancy and Kathy huddled together and began to talk. It was something they were all used to seeing, but most of them didn't understand why Nancy even bothered with Kathy. Nancy and the majority of her friends were part of a group that others called Aspen Royalty. Basically, they were people who seemed to have enough money to do whatever they wanted, whenever they wanted. And a lot of them were self-proclaimed snobs who wanted nothing to do with people outside of their own social class. But Nancy was different. She made friends everywhere she went and didn't care if people had money or not. Kathy was a bank teller in town, and every time Nancy had gone to the bank, she thought Kathy seemed like a very nice person. So one day, Nancy had asked Kathy if she'd like to go to lunch, and Kathy said she'd love to. And the two women hit it off and had become close friends ever since. Now, even though Nancy didn't seem to care about their very different social classes, Kathy couldn't ignore it. And so quickly after becoming friends, Kathy began doing things like picking up Nancy's prescriptions at the pharmacy for her and going to the grocery store to make sure Nancy had her food, and she even helped keep track of how much money Nancy spent, even if Nancy didn't seem to care. And so whether Kathy or Nancy realized this, basically, Kathy had become Nancy's personal assistant, even though obviously Kathy was not getting paid to do this and still had to have her job at the bank to make ends meet. And so back at the party in the corner of the room, Nancy asked Kathy what was so urgent that it couldn't wait until after the party. And Kathy said she was just worried that not everything in Nancy's life had been settled before her Australia trip. And also, Kathy wanted to know if Nancy wanted Kathy to look after her house while she was gone. This was something that Kathy kind of automatically did for Nancy anytime Nancy was out of town. Again, sort of acting like her assistant, even though she wasn't. Nancy was sort of annoyed by this. She didn't feel like talking about this right in the middle of the party, and so she tried to just kind of softly end the conversation with Kathy, but Kathy was persistent and really wanted to know what Nancy needed while she was going to be gone. And so finally, Nancy told Kathy that yes, it would be great if you stopped by the house once in a while and made sure her dog was okay. And also, if Trey and his wife, who were going to be staying at Nancy's house, needed anything, well, it would be great if Kathy could help them with that too. And so Kathy nodded, understanding her assignments. And then Nancy took a swig of her champagne, flashed a smile, and then rejoined the party and left Kathy standing all alone in the corner. Three months later, on the morning of February 22nd, 2014, Kathy opened up Nancy's front door with her own key. She walked into the front room and she found Dr. Trey Styler and his wife waiting for her. Trey sat in a wheelchair with a couple of suitcases at his side, and Nancy's dog was laying at his feet. Over the past few months, Trey's health problems had only gotten worse, and he was really struggling to walk a lot of the time. Kathy looked frazzled, like she often did, and she asked the Stylers if they had everything and if they were ready to go. A few days earlier, Nancy had emailed Kathy to say she was coming home from Australia. When Nancy had left, she actually had not set a return date, at least not officially, but now this email served as letting people know she was coming back home. And so Kathy wanted to make sure everything in the house was perfect for Nancy when she got home, and that meant making sure Nancy had the house to herself. So Kathy had informed the Stylers that they needed to get out of the house and take all their belongings with them so she could straighten up before Nancy got there. In the front room, Trey leaned down, grabbed one of the suitcases, and put it on his lap. Trey's wife grabbed the other suitcase and told Kathy they were ready to go. But she said they were leaving a few things behind that they would want to come back to get. Kathy suddenly was panicked and said they really needed to make sure everything was out of the house. But in a calm, steady voice, Trey told her that everything was fine. He reminded Kathy that they had been paying rent on the house. They were not just guests here. They didn't want to cause any problems, but they were sure Nancy would be okay with having some of their things still in the house just for a few more days. Then Trey pushed himself through the room towards the front door, and his wife and Kathy followed. They made it outside, and right away Trey began to shiver. The sun was shining, but there was snow on the ground, and it was only about 25 degrees Fahrenheit, so right below freezing. Trey had also lost quite a bit of weight recently, which contributed to him feeling cold. His wife helped him into Kathy's car and then put his wheelchair and their suitcases in the trunk. Then Kathy hopped in the driver's seat and drove the couple a few miles away to the hotel where they were going to stay until their new house was ready. And then after dropping the couple off, Kathy headed back to Nancy's. That evening, Kathy drove to the airport with Nancy's dog in the back seat. She knew Nancy would be thrilled to see him as soon as she landed. A little later, after flying for almost 24 hours and experiencing a massive 16-hour time change, Nancy finally stepped off the plane in Colorado. She somehow felt exhausted, but also completely wired, and she really had no idea what day it was. Kathy met Nancy at the baggage claim and helped her get everything over to the car. Nancy climbed into the back seat, and her dog jumped on her and licked her face. Nancy was glad to be back. When they got back to Nancy's house that evening, even though Nancy was dealing with major jet lag and felt totally exhausted, no matter what she tried, she couldn't fall asleep. So Kathy just stayed with her that night to make sure she really was okay and that if she needed anything, she would go get it. And then for the next 36 hours, Nancy just really couldn't quite fall asleep, and so she was just totally exhausted and miserable. But then finally, on the morning of February 24th, so a day and a half after Nancy got home, she just totally crashed. Kathy stayed in the bedroom with Nancy for a bit, but when it was clear Nancy really had fallen asleep and was not going to wake up anytime soon, Kathy went down to the kitchen, and she made sure Nancy's dog had plenty of food and water, and then she found a piece of paper and a marker, and she made a do not disturb sign. Kathy knew that secretly, Nancy hated being woken up before she was ready, and so she did not want anybody to disturb Nancy. And so Kathy walked outside, and she taped the sign to the front door. Then she got into her own car and drove back to her own apartment. On the morning of February 26th, so 2 days after Kathy left Nancy's house when Nancy had finally fallen asleep, Trey and his wife came back to Nancy's house to get the rest of their stuff. They saw the do not disturb sign that was on the door, and they assumed Nancy had to be sleeping, but they still wanted to get their things, and they also really wanted to talk with Nancy to make sure everything was okay with the house. So Trey's wife used her key and they opened the door, and the second they went inside, they were hit with this horrible smell. Trey covered his mouth and nose and wanted to go back outside, but his wife said she heard something and she rushed to the kitchen. There, she saw Nancy's dog pacing back and forth and squealing. His food and water bowls were empty, and he had used the kitchen floor like a bathroom. Trey's wife looked at the scene completely confused. Nancy could be flighty sometimes and leave town almost on a whim, but she loved her dog and always made sure he was well taken care of anytime she was gone. But Trey's wife told herself, maybe Nancy hadn't heard the dog squealing because she was in a really deep sleep, still worn out from her trip. So she went upstairs, walked down the hall to Nancy's bedroom, opened the door, and went inside. And when she did, she felt even more confused about the whole situation. Because Nancy wasn't in there. And it looked like her bed had been totally stripped, like Nancy had gone to do a load of laundry and never came back or something. Trey's wife immediately headed right back downstairs and found her husband still waiting by the door, and she told him what she saw. So Trey's wife called Kathy at the bank where she was working and filled her in. When Kathy heard what was going on, she said this all sounded really strange because Nancy had been sleeping when she left the house, and Kathy had made sure the dog had plenty of food and water. So did this mean Nancy hadn't checked on the dog in over 2 days? Trey's wife said she would clean it all up, take the dog out, and make sure he was okay and fed before she left, but she was worried about Nancy. Kathy said she felt the same way. So she hung up and called Nancy, but it went straight to voicemail. So she sent Nancy several text messages and also an email. But by 5:30 p.m., when Kathy got off work, she still hadn't heard anything from Nancy. So she drove straight to Nancy's house. A few minutes later, Kathy arrived at Nancy's. She first checked on the dog and then went upstairs to Nancy's bedroom. And when she went inside, she saw the bed was stripped, just like Trey's wife had said. Kathy walked about 15 feet across Nancy's bedroom to a large walk-in closet. Now, this closet was bigger than a lot of people's bedrooms, and Nancy had actually converted it into a meditation room. She had hung Tibetan prayer flags on the wall and filled it with candles and personal keepsakes. Kathy knew that Nancy did not like anyone going in that closet, but she knew she had to go in because she had to find Nancy. And so Kathy first knocked on the door of this meditation room, but it was silent inside. So she eventually reached down and grabbed the doorknob, but when she turned it, she felt that it was locked, and Nancy's key to the closet was nowhere to be found. So Kathy ultimately walked back downstairs, went outside, got in her car, and sped back to her apartment, and there she grabbed her duplicate key to Nancy's walk-in closet that Kathy kept on its own keychain, and then with the key in hand, she drove back to Nancy's house. At about 5:45 p.m., Kathy walked into Nancy's bedroom again, and this time she saw something she'd overlooked. There was a small splash of blood on the headboard of the bed, and when she saw this, Kathy began to shake. Then Kathy slowly turned towards the meditation room, the walk-in closet, and she began walking in that direction. And when she got there with shaking hands, she used her key and opened the door. And when she looked inside, at first, it looked like the way it always did, with all the different keepsakes and the flags and the candles. But right as Kathy was about to leave, she noticed something on the ground. And when she looked more closely, she began to scream. Kathy immediately grabbed her phone and dialed 911. And when the operator answered, Kathy could barely speak. She was basically hyperventilating. But finally, she did manage to shout that her friend, Nancy Pfister, was dead inside of her closet, and she was sure Nancy had been murdered. Kathy's 911 call took the Pitkin County Sheriff's Department by complete surprise. Crime was rare in Aspen, Colorado, and there hadn't been a murder in town in over a decade. And on top of that, almost everybody in the area knew who Nancy Pfister was. She was basically a celebrity in Aspen. If Nancy really had been murdered, the county police knew this would be their highest profile case in a very long time. So they immediately reached out to the state police and the district attorney's office for help. And not long after that, an investigator with the DA's office named Lisa Miller parked her car in the long driveway in front of Nancy's house and stepped outside. Investigator Miller was tall with light brown hair, and she was wearing a gray wool overcoat and dark sunglasses. Miller had a reputation for being a staunch advocate for victims and for being very straightforward when dealing with suspects. From where she was standing, Miller looked around and saw all the huge aspen trees spreading out across Nancy's huge property, and she was also able to look inside of Nancy's house through her large front windows, and it was beautiful inside. And so Miller thought, this is like one of the most beautiful places she'd ever seen if it wasn't for the fact that county police officers were stretching crime scene tape all across the yard. Miller saw a couple of deputies talking with Kathy a few feet from Nancy's front door, and she also saw Sheriff Joey DeSalvo standing nearby with Nancy's dog. Miller waved to DeSalvo and walked over to him. She asked him if he had seen the body yet, but DeSalvo just shook his head and Miller could tell he was on the verge of tears. DeSalvo said Nancy was a good friend of his. Before he was sheriff, he'd had a bit of a wild side, and actually he and Nancy used to party together. And he also said that he was the one who'd been called in to deal with Hunter S. Thompson's body after the writer had killed himself, and seeing someone he knew covered in blood like that had haunted DeSalvo for years, so he couldn't bring himself to go look at Nancy's body. Miller said she understood and just told him that he would need to tell her everything he knew. DeSalvo nodded and said that Kathy, the friend of Nancy's who had found the body and called 911, had told him that when she went into the bedroom closet, she had found her friend's body on the floor. Nancy's body was wrapped up in some sheets and a carpet, and her hair was matted with blood. That's about all he knew as far as the body was concerned. But there was one more thing that Kathy had told him. Kathy said that she had noticed some of Nancy's pill bottles were missing from her bathroom. Miller thanked DeSalvo, slipped on a pair of gloves, and then walked inside the house with one of the sheriff's deputies. Miller and the deputy headed upstairs and walked directly into Nancy's bedroom. They noticed the bed was stripped, and they saw blood on the headboard. Then they stepped into the closet that had been turned into a meditation room and looked down at the floor. But for a second, they both just stood there confused, because it just looked like there was a blanket and a pile of sheets laying there. And so Miller crouched down, and it wasn't until she was right over the blanket and sheets that she could tell they were actually wrapped around something. Miller kept staring at the pile for a second, and then she asked the deputy if Kathy had mentioned moving the blanket or touching it in some way. But the deputy said, according to Kathy, she had not touched anything in the closet. This made no sense to Miller, because at this moment, it was really impossible to tell if what was wrapped up inside of these sheets and this carpet was actually Nancy Pfister's body. And Miller definitely couldn't see any blonde hair matted with blood nearby like Kathy claimed to have seen inside of this closet. Miller nodded to the deputy, and so he crouched down, and together, they began to unwrap the blanket and the sheets. And as they did, they heard a strange sound, like the sheets were rubbing against something plastic. And then finally, once they had unspooled the bedding, they tossed it aside, and what they were left with was blood-stained trash bags wrapped around a dead body. Miller began to remove the trash bag covering the victim's head, and this is when she saw blonde hair matted with blood, just like Kathy had said. Miller finally pulled the trash bag all the way away, revealing the victim's face, and immediately the deputy lowered his head and told Miller that that was definitely Nancy Pfister. Miller wanted to wait for the state forensics team to arrive before handling the body anymore, so she and the deputy stepped out of the closet and began to search the rest of the house. But during the search, Miller didn't find any signs of forced entry or of a robbery. I mean, expensive paintings still hung on the wall, and Nancy's electronics and computer were plainly visible but looked untouched. And so Miller headed back outside into the cold winter air, and she saw Kathy, so she walked over to her and introduced herself, and she told Kathy they would need to talk at length at some point. But for now, Miller said she only had one question. Had Kathy touched the blanket or the sheets on the floor inside of that closet? Kathy shook her head and said no. She said she really had not touched anything in the closet, and as soon as she saw her friend's body on the floor, she called 911. And so Miller thanked her and went back inside of Nancy's house. Not long after Miller's initial sweep of the house, state forensics officers arrived on the scene. They followed Miller to Nancy's bedroom and began searching for prints, and they also took a sample from the blood spatter on the headboard. Then they flipped over the mattress and found several large bloodstains on it. After that, the officers went into the closet and began to do a thorough search of the body. All the while, Miller kept looking back and forth between the closet and the bed. The bloodstains on the headboard and the mattress made it seem like Nancy had been attacked in bed and then dragged, 15 feet or so across the room to the closet. The killer had also flipped the mattress over to try to hide the bloodstains and then clearly wrapped the body up in bedding and trash bags. And this was not an easy task. Just moving Nancy's body around would have been heavy and cumbersome, and there were so many steps the killer had to complete before leaving the house. And so as a result, Miller knew the killer would have needed a lot of time after killing Nancy, and also a lot of strength to pull this off. Or the killer would have needed a partner. And so Miller thanked the forensics officers and headed back downstairs, and she was still taking in everything she'd seen and heard, but at this point, she was sure about one thing. Kathy had lied to the police, because Nancy's body was not visible inside of the closet. And so if Kathy said she had seen her friend's blonde hair matted with blood, that meant either she did move the blankets and the carpet, and that's how she saw it, and then covered it back up, or Kathy just knew Nancy's hair was matted with blood because Kathy had killed her or had assisted in killing her. Investigator Miller knew that the murder of a wealthy socialite would send shockwaves through Aspen, and it would quickly lead to gossip and panic among locals and vacationers, so she didn't waste any time. Not long after Miller searched Nancy's house, she told Kathy to come down to the sheriff's station to meet with her and county and state police investigators. That day, Kathy stepped into the small interview room at the station. Kathy was average height with long brown hair, and she wore jeans and a red sweatshirt. And she looked very upset from the moment she sat down directly across from Miller. Miller spoke calmly and quietly. She thanked Kathy for coming in and then asked her to walk them through all the details of what happened when she went inside of Nancy's house, all the way through to calling 911. Kathy said when she'd gone to Nancy's the first time, she noticed some of Nancy's pill bottles were missing, and she also noticed the closet door, the meditation room, was locked. And then when she went looking for the key to that closet that she knew Nancy always kept in her bedroom, she found it was gone. And so this was all very strange. And so that's what led Kathy to go back to her place, get her own key to the closet, and rush back to Nancy's house. Then suddenly, Kathy's voice trailed off and she began wailing and heaving and struggling to breathe. The investigators worried she was hyperventilating, like she had during her 911 call. But despite Kathy's hysterics, Miller noticed something about Kathy that was very strange. Even though Kathy was visibly sobbing, Miller couldn't see any tears. Miller did not like to judge how people grieved, but she had seen suspects act like this before. And they often used these huge displays of emotion to try to cover up their own guilt, or to at least avoid answering questions. Finally, when Kathy calmed down, Miller immediately began asking questions. She asked Kathy again if she had touched the bedding or Nancy's body when she went into the closet. Miller wanted to give Kathy a chance to change the story that she'd told her at the house. But Kathy said she had not touched Nancy. When she was in the closet, she had just looked at the floor, saw her friend's bloody hair, and immediately knew Nancy was dead. At this point, Miller sat up straight in her chair. Her height could make her intimidating, but her demeanor always remained totally calm. Miller thought there was a good chance Kathy was lying, but there was also a chance Kathy had been so upset that she really didn't remember everything that happened. People in shock can forget things, so maybe Kathy had partially uncovered Nancy's body, covered it back up, and then sort of blocked it out of her mind. Another deputy in the room pushed the interview forward and asked Kathy if she resented Nancy for her money. Was she angry that she had to run around doing errands for Nancy while never getting paid a dime for it? But Kathy shook her head. She said it wasn't like that. She and Nancy were extremely close and they loved each other. And something about the way Kathy said that struck Miller as strange. She couldn't be sure, but this woman seemed like more than just a broken-hearted friend. So Miller leaned in and asked Kathy if she and Nancy were actually lovers. Kathy looked very surprised by this question, but she took a deep breath and looked very calm for the first time in the interview, and then she said that she and Nancy had been intimate, but only one time and that it didn't matter. They were just friends who cared about each other. Kathy insisted that she was not some kind of jealous girlfriend and that she had nothing to do with Nancy's murder. Miller didn't show any sort of reaction on her face. She had no idea if Kathy was actually telling the truth about being intimate with Nancy only once, but she thought that if it was true, certainly once could have been enough to complicate the relationship. And so after a tense silence, Miller asked if Kathy could think of anyone who might have wanted to hurt her friend. Kathy sat there silent. An angry look came across her face, and then she nodded. She said she had a pretty good idea of who wanted to kill Nancy. It was Dr. Trey Styler and his wife. After the interview with Kathy, investigator Miller thought that Kathy was either directly involved with the murder or just knew more than she was letting on. Kathy had easy access to Nancy's house and a key to the walk-in closet where Nancy had been found. Kathy also had a sexual relationship with Nancy at least one time, and she seemed to know details about the body that only the killer would know. But all the evidence pointing at Kathy was still circumstantial, so for the time, police let her go home. Soon after Kathy left, county officers located Trey and his wife at the hotel where they were staying, and they asked them to come to the station. When Trey walked into the interview room for his interview, Miller was taken aback by how frail this man looked. He clearly struggled to walk, and he was extremely underweight for his height. This just was not a guy with the physical strength to murder Nancy, then wrap her up, drag her to the closet, and then flip over a mattress. It just was not possible. But Kathy, in her interview, really seemed to think that Trey and his wife were capable of killing Nancy and had wanted to kill Nancy. So Miller began by asking Trey about his relationship with Nancy and his time living alone inside of her house. Trey would admit that Nancy could be very difficult to deal with as a landlord. She was terrible at keeping records and often thought she was owed money that she had already been paid. But Trey had said that working with Kathy and Nancy's attorney had made things a lot easier, so any issues he might have had with renting the house always got worked out. When Trey's wife had her interview, she basically said the same thing as her husband. And even though she was not frail like her husband, investigators did not think this slight woman in her mid-60s could have physically carried out the murder on her own either. So by the time Trey and his wife left the station, investigators still believed that Kathy was the most likely suspect. And Miller thought there were two key pieces of evidence they needed to find to directly link Kathy to the murder. There were Nancy's missing pills and Nancy's missing key to the closet. On February 28, 2014, 2 days after Nancy's body was discovered, a county sanitation worker walked along a street checking the public trash cans. A lot of mountain towns in Colorado have strict rules about what can and can't be deposited in public trash cans in an effort to keep bears away. And so sanitation workers literally check the trash cans to make sure these rules are being followed. And so this worker opened a trash can out in front of some shops, and right away something caught his eye. In an open bag, he saw several pill bottles. This type of personal trash was not going to attract bears, but it was still not allowed in public trash cans. So he leaned in to grab the bag, and when he got closer, he saw the name on the bottles, Nancy Pfister. Like everybody in the area, the worker knew about Nancy's murder, so he immediately contacted the sheriff's department. Investigator Miller got word that the missing pills had been found, and she couldn't believe her luck. It was like a prayer had been answered. Then, the following day, a man was walking down the sidewalk not far from where the pills had been found, and he saw something on the ground, glinting in the sunlight. He bent down and saw it was a key, and there was a tag on the keychain that said Owner's Closet. He picked it up and handed it over to a county police officer who was parked nearby. And back at the sheriff's department, it did not take long for officers to realize that this key was the missing key to Nancy's meditation room. And so investigators started to feel like they must have a guardian angel or something. In the span of 2 days, 2 random people had located key pieces of evidence that helped break the case wide open. Because the locations where the key and the pill bottles had been found made it pretty clear who had gotten rid of them. So, over the next couple of weeks, investigators followed up on the evidence, shored up their case, and then made an arrest. Then, about 3 months later, in June, investigator Miller, along with officers from the county and state police, sat in an interview room and listened to the killer's full confession. Based on that confession, the following is a reconstruction of what investigators were told happened to Nancy Pfister on the night of February 24th, 2014. That night, the killer stood at the bottom of Nancy's stairs inside of her house, holding several trash bags and an electrical cord in one gloved hand and a hammer in the other. They walked up the stairs slowly, trying not to make any noise. Once they reached the second floor, they headed down the hall and walked into Nancy's bedroom. The killer saw Nancy asleep in her bed. She had her headphones in, and she was wearing an eye mask to block out any light. This put the killer at ease. It didn't look like Nancy was going to wake up and fight back. So, the killer walked over to the bed and put down the trash bags and the cord, but kept the hammer in their hand. Then they just stood there staring at Nancy as she slept. After taking a breath, the killer slowly raised that hammer up into the air and then smashed it down into Nancy's head. The killer felt Nancy's skull crack, but they immediately raised the hammer again and kept swinging it down at her head and face. As they did, blood splashed against the headboard and ran down into the mattress. Eventually, the killer stopped their frenzied attack and lowered the hammer, and then stared down at Nancy's now dead body. Then they dropped the hammer onto the trash bags, and then took the top blanket off the bed and placed it on the floor, Then the killer quickly pulled the bloody sheets off the bed and threw those on top of Nancy's body, and then they grabbed the corners of the blanket and began to drag the blanket with Nancy on top of it over to the walk-in closet. When they reached the closet, the killer noticed Nancy's key was sticking out of the lock on the closet door. So they dropped the blanket, used the key to open the door, and then dragged Nancy inside the closet. Then they ran back into the bedroom, grabbed the trash bags, and went back into the closet. There, the killer crouched down and wrapped Nancy's head in one of the bags. They cinched it tight around her neck using the electrical cord, then they also wrapped up her torso and her legs with the other trash bags. Once they were satisfied, the killer also wrapped Nancy in her own bed sheets, as well as her own blanket, and then left her right in the middle of the closet. The killer stood up and looked down at the floor where Nancy was, and to them, it was barely even noticeable that a body was under all those layers. So they stepped out of the closet, closed and locked the door, and pocketed Nancy's key. Then they went back to Nancy's bed and flipped it over so the blood wouldn't show. Then the killer went into the bathroom and took a few pill bottles from the counter. They figured this might make it look like Nancy had just taken off for a few days. Finally, the killer headed downstairs, carrying the hammer and the pills in their hands, and as they exited the house, they could hear the sound of Nancy's dog barking in the kitchen. But they didn't care. They just rushed out to their car, hopped inside, and drove a few miles away to the hotel where they were staying. In the days following Nancy's murder, investigators came to believe that Kathy was involved, because it looked like she had lied, and because she knew details that she could not have seen without handling the body. But then, police received those two key pieces of missing evidence, Nancy's pill bottles and her closet key, and they were both found right near the hotel where Trey and his wife were staying. And when investigators followed up with them, they discovered that Trey and his wife's relationship with Nancy had actually totally fallen apart while Nancy was in Australia. Nancy was not just absent-minded when it came to getting her rent like Trey had suggested. Instead, she was aggressive and kind of a bully. She wanted the Stylers to pay several months' rent, which was over $13,000, in cash all at once. But Trey insisted that was not what they had agreed to, and his medical bills were draining his savings, so paying that all at once really was not an option. Over the course of Nancy's trip, both parties got their attorneys involved and started accusing the others of trying to rip them off. So by the time Nancy finally flew back to Colorado, Trey and his wife had made it clear they were very, very angry at her. In fact, they had told Kathy on several occasions that they wished Nancy was dead. And it would turn out Kathy had basically said the same thing to the Stylers. She also seemed fed up with Nancy, specifically the demands Nancy kept putting on her. And she said there was a dark and cruel side to Nancy that really only people close to her saw. Her public perception is she was not this snobby, awful person, but, behind closed doors, at least to Kathy and to the Stylers, she was. When investigators learned all of this, they no longer believed Trey and his wife were innocent. But they also didn't believe that this couple was physically capable of committing this murder without help. So investigators became convinced that the Stylers and Kathy had killed Nancy together. And in March of 2014, police arrested Trey, his wife, and Kathy. But then in June, when all three suspects were behind bars, investigator Miller sat and listened to a full confession. But that confession only came from Trey. He claimed he had planned and carried out the murder all by himself. His wife and Kathy had nothing to do with it. In fact, Trey explained that he'd experienced this insane jolt of adrenaline on the night of the murder, something he had never felt before, that made it feel like he had no health problems. And so he said that was how he was able to kill Nancy with a hammer, drag her body to the closet, and wrap her up in blankets, sheets, and trash bags. And so based on Trey's confession, his wife and Kathy were eventually released from jail. Trey was ultimately sentenced to 20 years in prison, but in 2015, he hanged himself in his cell. After Trey's death, his wife received a $1 million life insurance payout, and she would go on to write a book about Nancy Pfister's murder. To this day, some people involved in this investigation do not believe Trey Styler acted alone, that basically he confessed in order to protect Kathy and his wife.
In 1985, Kevin O'Keefe was a 36-year-old outdoor enthusiast that lived in Sacramento, California. He loved being out in nature, going hiking and camping, and in fact, he had always wanted to go camping in Alaska. By the summer of 1985, Kevin was actually doing research on areas in Alaska that he could potentially go camping. and he settled on this area called Glacier Bay National Park, which even by Alaskan standards is particularly wild and totally remote. Kevin planned to go camping on his own, so he decided he would need to take a class on how to survive the Alaskan wilderness because he's going to be out there by himself and he's chosen this place that's incredibly rugged. So he actually enrolled and participated in a class teaching you how to go camping in Alaska. Then on September 20th of 1985, he flew from Sacramento to Juneau, Alaska, where he commuted his way up to Glacier Bay National Park. When he arrived at the park's headquarters, he went up and introduced himself to the park rangers that were working there. He told them he'd be over near the Wolf Point area, which was an area right against the water, and he said he was going to be here for about 3 weeks. He planned on leaving on October 10th. So everybody who works there is aware that there's this guy, Kevin O'Keefe, who's going to be by himself for almost 3 weeks camping near the water. No one in Kevin's family or any of the park rangers heard from Kevin for the next couple of weeks. But the whole point of this trip was basically to escape reality and go live in nature for a few weeks, so no one's raising any red flags. A few weeks later, on October 8th, which is 2 days before Kevin said he was planning to leave the park, which he told park rangers and they knew he was there, a couple of park rangers were in a boat patrolling some waterways around Wolf Point, which is the area where Kevin was camping. The rangers decided to take a bit of a detour to get inside of Wolf Point and actually check in on Kevin and just see how he was doing, because they knew he was out here by himself. They're making their way down, and as they turned this last corner where they could finally see Kevin's sight, immediately they knew something was wrong. The first thing they noticed was Kevin's tent was not in the area that it was supposed to be in. There was kind of a designated spot on the soil where you'd place your tent, but his tent was actually down a few meters on this beach that butted up against his campsite, and some of his gear was outside of his tent. Not strewn everywhere, but outside of his tent, like you had placed it outside. As they're looking at his tent, they realized that the top strut that kind of held the top of the tent together was folded down. It looked like it had broken right in the middle. They called out for Kevin. He was nowhere around, and they kind of rationalized what they saw. They thought, he's leaving in a couple of days. My guess is he's probably preparing his campsite for an exit. Maybe he went out to, go on a day hike or something. I'm sure everything is fine. So they leave and come back the next day just to double check. And when they arrive, there's been no change. The tent is still sitting down on the beach with that strut collapsed. His gear is sitting outside of his tent like a sleeping bag and sleeping pad. It's clear that Kevin has not been to this campsite since the last time they saw him, which was 24 hours earlier. So now they're outright concerned and they decide to launch a search for Kevin. They began flying little airplanes over the area where Kevin's campsite was and the surrounding areas. No sign of Kevin. They brought ground searchers with dogs onto his campsite. They're looking everywhere. No sign of Kevin. But they did discover at his campsite that virtually all of the equipment you would expect to be at a campsite in Alaska of someone who's staying there for a few weeks, well, it was all there. He had his backpack fully packed as if he was going to go on a hike. It had food, it had extra clothes and water. It was all packed right up against a tree. All of his sleeping equipment and his cooking equipment. And oddly, there was lots of food that Kevin still had left at his campsite that was out in the open. And no animals had touched it, which is a complete anomaly. As they began searching the outer areas of his campsite, dogs were able to locate Kevin's boots, his glove liner, and his hat. They were tucked away in this gully about a half mile away from this campsite. They were not visible to the naked eye. It took dogs finding it to locate these items. After finding these items, the early speculation was it looks like Kevin was attacked by bears or some other predator. But the park rangers, who knew this area extremely well and had seen other bear attacks, said, I don't think this is a bear attack because there's no sign of a death struggle anywhere at his camp. If you get attacked by a big predator, you're going to fight for your life to save yourself. You're going to grab onto things and flail around. It's fairly obvious, and there's none of that. There's also no blood or remains or any indication that someone was hurt in this space. And if an animal had come into this camp and attacked Kevin and eaten Kevin, They certainly would have taken the food that was out and about in the campsite, but none of the food was touched. As the investigation continued, rangers would say how strange it was that no wild animals are coming into this campsite. There's no activity. There's nothing in the area. It's like the animals are staying away from Kevin's campsite. When they couldn't find any sign of Kevin, the investigators went to speak with Kevin's family and asked them, did he have any signs that he was looking to end his own life? Do you have any information you can give us about him? And they said, no, he was really happy, well-adjusted, excited about this trip. He had taken a class to prepare himself for this trip. He told us that he planned on taking a couple day hikes, but no overnights. And he had no plans to meet other people while he was there. He was just looking to be on his own in nature. But after just a few days, they had to call the search off because there was no sign of this guy. He was just gone. Knowing that all of Kevin's gear was still located at his campsite means he did not leave to go on one of those day hikes that he had told his family that he might be going on. Because going into the wilds of Alaska without your gear is a death sentence. So Kevin must have been at his campsite when something horrible happened to him. But we know it wasn't an animal attack because there was no sign of that and no animals were coming near this campsite. So if it wasn't an animal attack, then what was it that caused his tent to shift down to the beach and have his gear strewn about on the sand and have his boots and glove liner and hat be located a half-mile away in some gully? And where's Kevin?
The next and final story of today's episode is called The Broken Tent. On the afternoon of June 4th, 1960, a 15-year-old girl named Mela Bjorklund climbed off the back of her boyfriend's motorcycle. Her boyfriend was an 18-year-old named Nils Gustafsson, and this couple had just driven 18 miles from the city in southern Finland where they lived to get to this beautiful forest and lake where they, along with another couple, were going to go camping. The other couple, who was still a few minutes behind them, was Nils's best friend, Seppo, and his girlfriend, whose name was Anja. As Nils parked his motorcycle, Mela looked out over the lake, and she saw it was totally beautiful, the forest completely wrapped around the lake, and there were all these people out on the lake, boating and swimming and having a great time. But despite all these people here, to Mela, it still kind of felt very quiet and peaceful. This didn't feel like a big touristy destination. It really felt like they were out in the wild. And for Mela, who loved the outdoors, this felt like a great spot to celebrate her 16th birthday, because that's actually why the couples were out camping. Mela was turning 16 in a couple of days, and so this was going to be her party. Just then, Mela heard another motorcycle approaching, and she turned around and she saw it was the other couple. It was Seppo who was driving, and Anja was right behind him. And Seppo, he looked up and saw Mela looking at him, and he grinned and braked hard with his motorcycle and kind of swung the back wheel out like he was in an action movie. And Mela thought it was totally funny, and she started laughing, and that's when Nils turned around and he saw his girlfriend laughing heartily at Seppo. A moment later, all four friends were giving each other hugs and saying hello, and then after catching up, the friends walked over to this small shack that was right by the water. It was the snack kiosk. Their plan was to load up on supplies and then quickly make their way into the forest where they'd actually be camping and just relax, enjoy the night, and go to bed. But as the friends walked towards the snack kiosk, Seppo made a joke about how his motorcycle was way better than Nils's motorcycle. And Mela, who was Nils's boyfriend, she laughed at this joke and thought it was really funny. But as she was laughing, she happened to look over at Nils, her own boyfriend, and she could tell, he just looked upset, like he was scowling at her and also at Seppo. And immediately, Mela felt really bad, because she was thinking, maybe Nils thinks I'm flirting with Seppo by laughing at all of his jokes. Now, keep in mind, Mela really liked Nils, and they had really just started dating, but for really the first time in Mela's life, she was dating someone who clearly liked her back. She had been in other kind of small relationships where it felt very one way, but this was different.
And so Mela really did not want Nils to think anything was going on with her and Seppo, because there was nothing going on. But when Mela looked over at Nils again to kind of confirm that he really did look mad, he didn't look mad. He was smiling and laughing again. And so Mela told herself, she must have just imagined that Nils was never upset. It was all in her head. So Mela reached over and grabbed Nils's hand, and the two couples walked the rest of the way over to the kiosk. The snack kiosk was really just this little shack right near the beach, and then behind the shack was a small house where the owners of the snack kiosk lived. And as soon as they got up to the kiosk, Mela noticed the woman who was manning the kiosk had her back to them and didn't seem remotely interested in turning around and helping them get what they needed. And so Mela was just like, okay, hey, excuse me, we just want to buy something. And the woman at this point, she whipped her head around and she looked at Mela really angrily and just said, "What do you want?" And Mela, who was totally taken aback by this, she kind of mumbled an apology, not really even sure if she did something wrong or not. And then she asked the woman if they could just get a couple of beers and sodas and they'd be on their way. And as this is happening, Seppo and Anja, who were right behind Mela, they were just giggling the whole time. Because this woman's behavior was so bizarre and so unexpected, they just couldn't help themselves. So as the teenagers are giggling, this woman is bending down and getting the sodas and beer, and she's huffing really angrily like this is such a huge inconvenience, and then she just slammed them up on the counter. As the woman was punching in the total into the cash register, Mela found herself looking over at the house behind the shack where this woman presumably lived, and Mela noticed there were all these empty beer bottles that lined the front railing of the house. And so Mela figured, maybe this was a clue as to why this woman was so hostile. Any household that produced that many empty beer cans likely was not a very happy place to live. And so finally, the woman in the kiosk gave the teenagers their total, at which point Nils stepped forward and he actually paid for the stuff instead of Mela. And then as Nils and Mela grabbed the things they bought and were about to turn and leave, the woman in the kiosk kind of cleared her voice and she asked them, hey, are you camping out by the lake? And to Mela, it seemed like this woman was suddenly being really nice, maybe as a way to kind of make up for how rude she was when they first walked over. And so Mela put on a smile and told this woman that, we're staying out by the lake. We're really excited about it. Thanks for asking. But the woman did not seem happy to hear this. Instead, the woman kind of scowled and then told them that they better set their tent as far away from here as possible. None of the teenagers had any idea how to respond to this. So they just kind of stood there and there was this really intense, awkward silence for a moment. And then the kiosk lady just began literally shooing the teenagers away, telling them to go, get out of here. And so finally the teenagers did turn around and started walking. But after walking pretty far away from the kiosk, they heard the kiosk woman yell out at them one more time. She basically yelled at them that her and her family had already had lots of trouble with wild teenagers in the past camping out around this lake. And so now she and her husband were totally sick of it. And so after the kiosk lady yelled out this final comment, Seppo and Nils and Anja, they just started laughing because it just seemed so absurd how disrespectful and awful this woman was being, to the point where it was comical. But Mela, she didn't think it was funny. She seemed mean and very angry, and it totally freaked Mela out. But just a couple of minutes later, the teens were back at their motorcycles, and Nils and Mela hopped on one, and Seppo and Anja hopped on the other, and then they began driving down this wooded path that would take them to their campsite. The ride to their campsite was a very short one, and where they were positioned was on this piece of land that sort of jutted out onto the lake. It was very heavily forested, and so it's this amazing view of the water, but it's very secluded in the trees. And so right away, Nils and Seppo, they parked their motorcycles up against the trees. They pulled out a simple canvas tent, and they strung it up between two birch trees. And then with their campsite all set up, they grabbed some beers, and the friends began to drink. And it didn't take long before Mela had totally forgotten about the kiosk woman and how awful she had been. After all, Mela had really been looking forward to this trip, and now she was here at the campsite, relaxing with her friends. I mean, this was great. Also, Mela was really excited about her relationship with Nils. It was a relatively new one, and it was obvious that, for once, her boyfriend was somebody who liked her as much as she liked him. And also, Nils was very handsome, and he was popular, and he had this dark brown hair that he combed straight up, and he always wore this leather jacket everywhere. And so Mela just really liked being around him. He was super cool and made her feel really grown up. After sitting around for about 30 minutes to an hour, just having a couple of drinks and swapping stories and kind of easing into their night, the friends eventually made their way down to the water, and they went swimming for a while, and they continued to drink down by the dock. And then when they were tired of swimming, the teens just laid on the dock and enjoyed looking out at the sunset. Even though actually in Finland at this time of the year, it's not really a sunset because the sun does not actually fully set. And so when this happens, these are known as white nights, which are very beautiful. I mean, it's kind of like this hazy glow in the sky from the sun not quite setting. And so on this night, the teens are out there on the dock. They had this beautiful, white night to look up at. And for Mela, she felt like this was the perfect birthday celebration. In fact, she would jot down in her diary later that night just how amazing everything was going and how much fun she was having with Nils and their friends. Finally, the teens were done down by the dock, so they grabbed their things, they went back up to the campsite, they dried off, they changed, and then all four of them piled into their one little tent to go to sleep. And eventually, all four of them would drift off to sleep, but then at some point in the middle of the night, Mela woke up. And she heard rustling sounds outside the tent, and so she wondered if, maybe one of the friends had gotten up, and so she sat up and looked out the tent, and she couldn't see anything. She just saw the kind of hazy night sky from the white night, and she couldn't really tell if everybody was inside the tent or not. But then suddenly, a dark, shadowy figure moved in front of the tent flap, the open tent flap. And so this shadowy figure totally blocked all the light that was coming into the tent from the white night. And then this shadowy figure looked into the tent, and they had these bright, glowing red eyes. And before Mela or anybody else in the tent could do anything, there was a snapping sound, and the tent fell down on top of them. The next morning at 6 a.m., two boys who were not in any way connected to these four teenagers were at this lake. They were over to the side doing some fishing, and they were looking kind of out generally in the direction of where the four teenagers had stayed the night before. And this particular day, the lake was not remotely crowded like it was the day before. Basically, it was a ghost town. And suddenly they saw emerge from the forest, basically where the teens had camped, was this young man with blonde hair who was just running away from where that campsite was. And so these boys just stared for a second at this random guy with blonde hair running away from the campsite until the boys lost interest and just went back to fishing. As the morning wore on, more and more people came to the lake, but nobody made their way out to the campsite where the teenagers had been the night before. That is, until a father and his two sons decided to head out that way to go to that dock to go swimming. And so this father and his sons began walking on the same wooded trail that Nils and Seppo had driven their motorcycles on to get out to that camping site, and he eventually makes it to the clearing in the forest where this campsite was, and right away he spots what looks like a crumpled heap of canvas kind of sitting between two trees, and he couldn't really tell what it was. And so the father walked a little bit closer to investigate, and eventually he realized what they were actually walking up on, at which point he threw up a hand to stop his sons from going any closer, and he turned around and he told his kids, "We have to leave right now." And so the father and his sons, they run back up that trail, they find a phone, and they call the police. When the police arrived at the lake just before noon, they would walk out to that campsite and they would see that crumpled heap of canvas, and then also in and around that crumpled heap were the four bodies of the four teenagers who had stayed there the night before. Anja and Seppo had not even made it out of the tent. They had been beaten and stabbed to death basically through the canvas fabric. Mela did manage to get out of the tent. However, she did not escape. She was kind of laying on top of the tent, and she had broken bones,
and it would turn out she was stabbed a total of 15 times, and some of those stabs came when she was alive, and some came when she was dead. And then laying next to her was the body of her boyfriend Nils, and he was basically unrecognizable. His head had been beaten to a pulp. As officers descended on the scene and began rifling through the teenagers' backpacks and different belongings, one officer knelt down near all the victims to look more closely at each of their injuries. And as they were looking at each of the victims, they suddenly heard this gasping sound. It's very faint, but they could definitely hear it. And to their shock, Nils, so Melo's boyfriend, he suddenly opened his eyes and he looked up at this officer. He was still alive. And this officer who's seeing this, who was totally convinced Nils was dead, as everybody else was at first unsure what to even do. But then a second later, the officer stood up and began screaming for a medic. After Nils was taken away in an ambulance, the different investigative teams that had descended on the scene began going over the evidence and different things they had found, and pretty quickly, the general feel amongst all the investigators was this crime scene does not make any sense. There were some things missing from the crime scene that seemed to indicate this could have been a robbery, like missing wallets and missing watches. But there were other things that were missing that just didn't really make any sense to have been taken. Like, for example, the 2 motorcycles that the boys drove in, they were still there, parked up against the tree. But their keys were gone, so why steal the keys and not take the motorcycles? And then also, Nils's prized leather jacket and his shoes were also missing. These were not particularly valuable. I mean, they might have been emotionally valuable to Nils, but they certainly were not valuable enough to warrant a robber, killing people to get their hands on them. So eventually, the police actually called in the military to come into the forest and help with the search. And when the military arrived and began fanning out all around this huge forest, they would make a really big discovery. They would find Nils's shoes. And these shoes were speckled with blood. And it was clear from the bloody tracks nearby that the killer must have, at some point, put these shoes on at the campsite and then walked away while still wearing them, and then ultimately, ditched them 500 meters away underneath that pile of leaves. In the days after the murders, the police chased down dozens of leads all over Finland, but none of them amounted to anything. Nils would actually survive the attack, but his face was so badly damaged with so many broken bones in his head that it took a really long time before he could even speak. But when he finally could, and the police were able to interview him, it became immediately clear that Nils did not have a good memory of the attack. And in fact, the day of the attack, basically the whole day, he didn't really remember it. However, Nils would remember one thing. He said during the chaos of the actual attack, he distinctly remembered seeing a dark, shadowy figure with these bright red, glowing eyes. But the police couldn't just go out and look for a dark figure with red eyes, and so instead they just made a note of this and continued their investigation. The only real lead the police got were from those 2 boys who were fishing out on the lake a day after the murders happened, where they saw that guy with blonde hair running away from where the teens had camped. Now, these 2 boys didn't know the significance of what they were seeing, but obviously when the news broke about the murders, they recalled seeing that guy right in the area where they now knew, that's where the murders had happened. And so the police created a composite sketch of, what the boys thought they saw, this blonde guy running, and they would send this sketch all over Finland, and they would ask people, to come forward if you've seen this guy. And loads of people immediately came forward and said, yep, I've seen that guy. But it would turn out the police were getting loads of false reports because the sketch looked like lots of men in Finland. So this was not a unique enough sketch, basically. However, there was one tip that came into police that did really stand out. The day after the murders happened, a man named Hans Osman checked into a hospital located about 13 miles away from where the lake was, where the murders happened. And this guy Hans, when he checks into the hospital, he starts complaining of having these really intense stomach pains. But the doctors don't believe him because Hans actually just appears to be very drunk and very aggressive. First of all, he looked exactly like the police composite sketch of the blonde running guy. Like he was that guy. And also, Hans was filthy. He was covered in dirt and mud, and there was all this dirt kind of embedded in his fingernails like he had been digging with his hands. And he also had all these red stains all over his clothes that he refused to explain. And so eventually, one of the doctors called the police, and when the police interviewed Hans, they would discover that he had a history of violence, and he also said he used to be a member of the Nazi Party, and he also was a member of the Russian secret police. And all of this just seemed like a lie, but basically he seemed like a very erratic and unstable person. But Hans had a rock-solid alibi. On the night of the murder, Hans was located in a city about 15 miles away from where the murders happened, at his girlfriend's house with his girlfriend and also his girlfriend's sister and brother-in-law. And so as much as they wanted Hans to be their guy, the police learned, obviously he's not. And this was basically how the entire investigation went. The police would interview over 4,000 people, but despite all that, they still could not figure out who did this. And so slowly, the case went cold. And that was it for 44 years. Lots of theories, but not one suspect. But then, in 2004, prosecutors made a stunning announcement. They said the killer was Nils Gustafsson, the 18-year-old boyfriend of Mela, who was the only one who survived the attack. And the prosecutors pointed to two pieces of evidence to support this theory. The first piece of evidence was there was this woman who was staying out at the lake on the night of the murders, not far from the teenagers' campsite, who remembered overhearing two men really aggressively fighting before the murders ultimately happened. Prosecutors hypothesized that what that woman overheard was Nils and Seppo fighting with each other. That Nils was mad at Seppo about something to do with Nils's girlfriend, Mela. Perhaps he really was upset that it seemed like Mela was flirting with Seppo, and so Nils felt betrayed, but, something was happening there where these two young men were fighting over a girl. In the prosecutor's eyes, this would also explain why Mela had been stabbed so many times. That basically Nils must have been so furious about whatever was happening between Mela and Seppo, and then, his rage took over and he really took it out on his girlfriend. The second piece of evidence the prosecutors used to support this idea that Nils was the killer were Nils's shoes, which were found under those leaves about 500 meters away from their campsite. The prosecutors said there was blood on the shoes, but not in the shoes. And none of the blood that were on these shoes belonged to Nils. And so prosecutors say that shows Nils murdered his friends while wearing his shoes and then, ran away from the campsite and ditched those shoes to hide them, underneath those leaves. And then he came back to the campsite and inflicted those horrible injuries on himself to make it seem like he also had been attacked. So in the end, Nils, 44 years after the fact, got arrested for these murders. And at the time he was arrested, Nils was 62 years old, he was working as a bus driver, and he was married with kids. But at Nils's trial, he absolutely maintained his innocence and did not waver from his story one bit. He basically said, look, I can't remember all the details of that day. I don't remember the attack very well. I don't really know what we did leading up to it, what happened after it. But what I do remember is I saw a dark, shadowy figure with glowing red eyes. That's all I remember. And the jury completely believed him, and he was easily acquitted, and in the end, Finland would even give him a huge monetary settlement for his mental suffering. Today, people tell lots of stories about these murders. I mean, the lake itself where this happened, Lake Bodom, is now completely famous for these murders. People go there just to be in the same place where these teens were killed. But a lot of the stories that circulate about these murders are so far-fetched that they just do not seem believable. Like suggesting that the campsite was cursed and that, the ghosts of murdered campers attacked the teens. It just does not seem like a viable theory. Other stories that circulate are really intriguing, but they don't really get you anywhere. Like periodically there's this photo that will circulate on the internet, and it's a picture of the crowd at one of the teens' funerals, and in the middle of this crowd is this guy whose face looks identical to that composite sketch of the running blonde man.
And in fact, people have come out and said he looks exactly like that guy, Hans Osman, who had shown up in the hospital, the day after the murders with the dirt and what looked like blood all over him, but he had that alibi. And so that picture makes its rounds on the internet and everybody gets jazzed up and says, there he is, that's the guy who killed the teens. But no one's ever been able to actually identify that person, and so it's gone nowhere. But there is one story that circulates about these murders that a lot of people believe is the truth. When the teenagers were killed, there was a 55-year-old man named Carl Valdemar Gilstrom who lived right on Lake Bodom. And Carl had a reputation for being really nasty and sometimes even lashing out at the campers who stayed in this area. And in fact, Carl would often get drunk and literally go and attack the other campers. He would cut down their tents in the middle of the night, he would throw rocks at their campsite, and then one time, he even fired a gun at a camper who was riding past him on a moped. He missed, but this guy is an absolute nightmare. And so after the murders happened, locals who knew about Carl immediately went to police and they were like, that's the guy who very likely did this. This is totally something he would do. But when police went and tried to speak to Carl, they wound up speaking to Carl's wife, who was the kiosk woman. The woman who was so nasty to the teens when they first arrived and basically told them to get away. Yeah, so the police talked to her and she would tell police that Carl was with her and her kids when the murders happened. And so the police believed her and never really considered Carl a serious suspect. But in the Lake Bodom area, when people heard he was not being looked at closely, people felt like this was a huge mistake. But 9 years after the murders, so at this point the case is totally cold, Carl is having a drink with his neighbor out near the Lake Bodom area, and as they're just sitting there having drinks, relaxing, Carl winds up admitting to the neighbor that he was the Lake Bodom murderer. He literally said to his neighbor, don't you understand that I'm the murderer of Bodom? And the neighbor apparently was so caught off guard and so horrified by this that they said to Carl, well, if that's the truth, you should go drown yourself. And then the next day, where was Carl found? Out in the lake, drowned, right near where the teens had been attacked. Now, the police were never able to actually figure out if his death was accidental, or if he had done it to himself, or if somebody else had done it to him. But that's the story, and lots of people believe that Carl was so racked with guilt over what he had done that he did what his neighbor suggested. On the evening of June 28, 1997, an 83-year-old woman named Leila Howard turned up the radio in the living room of her small home in Texas, and then she took a seat next to her husband, Raymond, on the couch. This was a song that both of them loved, and in the past, Leila knew her husband would have swooped her up and begun dancing with her right away. But Raymond was now 88 years old, he was also recovering from brain surgery, and they both were planning to go to bed in the next few minutes because they had a big day the next day. They were going to go to the Pioneer Day Music Festival, which is an annual fiddling festival located about 15 miles away from where Leila and Raymond lived, in the town of Salado, Texas. Leila and Raymond attended this festival basically every year, and so even though Raymond right now was a bit fragile from his surgery and his advanced age, the couple had not even considered missing it. Leila's son Hal had tried to persuade Leila to let him, Hal, drive the couple to the music festival, but Leila said no because Leila and Raymond were both fiercely independent and wanted to be in control of their lives, which included driving to and from this festival. Also, Leila had talked about maybe going someplace else after the festival ended with Raymond, kind of spontaneously just driving out and doing something, and so she really wanted to have her own car in case she did want to do that. And so after a few minutes, Leila and Raymond's favorite song came to an end and the DJ hopped back on the radio and began talking about the weather and the traffic. And at that point, Raymond and Leila, they stood up from the couch, they took each other's hands, and they walked upstairs to go to bed. The next morning, so June 29th, Leila and Raymond walked out the front door of their house, and they walked down to their driveway where their Oldsmobile car was parked. Leila helped Raymond get into the passenger seat, and then Leila took her spot in the driver's seat. And then a few moments later, after they were all buckled in and situated, Leila fired up the car, backed out the driveway, and began driving. That evening, Leela's son, Hal, decided to swing by Leela and Raymond's house to check in on them and see how the festival went. And so at about 5 p.m., Hal got to their house, and right away when he pulled up, he noticed that Leela and Raymond's car, the Oldsmobile, was not in the driveway. And so Hal thought that was pretty odd because by now they should have been back from the festival. In years past, they would always get home by about 3 p.m. at the absolute latest because they didn't like staying out late, and so it just seemed odd that they were not back by now. But at the same time, Hal knew that Leela had been thinking about maybe going out and doing something spontaneous after the event was over, and so he thought, maybe his mom and Raymond were out driving around somewhere and they'd be back later. But just for good measure, Hal did park the car and he walked up to the front door of the house and he did knock. But when there was no answer, he thought, you know what, I'll just go home and come back in a few hours and check in on them at that point. And so, a few hours later, at 8 p.m., Hal drove back to Leela and Raymond's house, and when he got there, he saw their car was still not back yet. And so now Hal's starting to feel pretty worried, and so he parked the car, he walked up to the front door, he did knock, there was no answer, and so he pulled out his set of keys, he opened up the door, and he walked inside. Now, as soon as he was in the house, nothing looked out of place. It actually looked very organized and clean like it normally was. But as he walked around looking for some sign of where Leela and Raymond were, all he could find was on one of the beds there were all these neat stacks of clothes that were laid out as if somebody was getting ready to pack but didn't finish packing. And so it just seemed like something's off here, something's not right. This doesn't seem like they just went out and did something spontaneous. Something must have happened at the festival. That's why they're not back yet. And so kind of in a panic, Hal ran outside and he called the police. And after reporting Leela and Raymond missing, he actually began calling news stations and telling them, can you please put out my mom and Raymond's picture because they're older and they're missing. I need your help. And in fact, that night, those TV stations did begin putting out all these reports about how Leela and Raymond were missing and for people to be on the lookout for them and their car. At the same time, the police immediately launched an investigation, and they quickly discovered that Leela and Raymond had never even made it to the music festival. They never got there. And then when the police drove the route that Leela would have taken to get to the music festival, they didn't find any car accidents or anything unusual on the route that would indicate that they got into some trouble or something. They checked their phone records, and Leela and Raymond had called nobody. There was no action on their credit cards, and so they hadn't bought anything. And the police would send out all these missing person reports to police officers all over the state of Texas, and nobody reported seeing anything or hearing anything. That is, until 3 days later on July 2nd. On that night, a police officer in a little town in Arkansas, located 500 miles away from where Leela and Raymond lived, this police officer was driving down the road when he spotted an Oldsmobile that was driving with its lights off. And so the officer pulled the car over and he ran the license plate and it came back as belonging to Leela and Raymond. But you gotta remember that this police officer was in Arkansas and so he had not received any updates about this missing couple. All those TV broadcasts and all the missing person alerts that were getting sent out all over the place, those were really only happening in the state of Texas. And so this officer has no clue that Leela and Raymond are missing. But he runs the plate, he sees it belongs to Leela and Raymond, and he goes up to the driver's side window, and he looks inside, and he sees Leela and Raymond. Leela's driving, Raymond's in the passenger seat, and they look like a really happy older couple. And the officer would say to Leela, hey, you're driving with your lights off. And Leela would say, oh my goodness, I'm so sorry. We were driving in Texas, and we got lost, and I just didn't notice. I'm really sorry. The officer believed her and felt like these were good people who just made an honest mistake. And so he just flicked her lights on and said, I'm going to give you a warning. No big deal, no ticket, but be careful with your lights. You got to make sure those are on at night. And Leela said, thank you very much. Of course, I'll be very careful with my lights. And then actually the officer gave Leela directions on how to get back to Texas from Arkansas. And then he got back in his cruiser and then he watched as Leela and Raymond pulled onto the main road and then disappeared into the darkness. The police officer in Arkansas who pulled them over would eventually put it together who he had pulled over, and at that point, Arkansas would get in on the search for Leela and Raymond. But for the next 2 weeks, despite having both states aggressively searching for this couple, nobody could find them. That is until July 12th, so that's 10 days after Leela and Raymond got pulled over by that cop in Arkansas. On that day, these two young boys were walking by a small stream in a town called Hot Springs, Arkansas, when they began to smell a terrible smell. They would end up telling their parents, who would come back to the stream and they'd smell it too, and they would end up alerting the police, and the police would come out and they would search that entire area, and they would find Leela and Raymond's Oldsmobile at the base of a 25-foot cliff, and inside the vehicle were Leela and Raymond, and they were both deceased. It looked very much like Leela and Raymond had driven off this cliff and they had landed down below, and that's what killed them. But when investigators went up to the top of that cliff, there were no skid marks on the cliff itself, which meant Leela, who was driving, never hit the brakes as she went over the cliff. Nobody knows why Leela and Raymond abruptly left their town and drove hundreds of miles into Arkansas instead of going to their favorite music festival, although their family members have speculated that it could be because Leela and Raymond had declining cognitive function, and so they basically didn't know what was going on, and that's why it happened. But this story about Leela and Raymond is what inspired a very, very famous song from the late 1990s. It's called The Way by Fastball, and for copyright reasons, we can't play it for you, but I'll sing you a line and see if you can remember this song. Where were they going without ever knowing the way? Anyone can see the road that they walk on is paved in gold. It's always summer, you'll never get cold. You'll never be hungry, you'll never be old and gray. Boom, there you go. If you know the song, now you know it's got a pretty intense backstory.
Our next story is called High Stakes.
On October 20th, 1986, Captain Alexander Kluyev was piloting a passenger plane that was about to descend down into a Russian airport for a layover. On board this plane were 94 occupants, including passengers and crew. And as the captain began going over in his mind the different steps he would need to follow to land this plane, he practically sighed with boredom. He had always thought life as a pilot would be exciting and interesting, but all he ever did were these short commercial flights around Russia, and they lacked any sort of thrill. In fact, the captain had flown this particular route so many times, he could practically do it in his sleep. And so as the captain was about to begin yet another boring descent to end yet another boring flight, he was suddenly struck with a very unexpected idea. And as he thought about it, he stopped what he was doing, and he just turned to his co-pilot, whose name was Gennady Zernov, and he said, "Hey, Gennady, can I ask you something?" At the same time that Captain Alexander and Gennady were having this conversation up in the cockpit, down on the ground inside of that Russian airport where the captain was supposed to land, an air traffic controller noticed on their radar that Captain Alexander's plane was coming in way too fast and at too steep of an angle to attempt a landing. And so the controller radioed up to the captain and said, "Hey, you're going too fast. Adjust your speed, adjust your angle. Otherwise, you're going to need to abort this landing." But the captain did not radio anything back to the controller. Instead, the plane continued its descent at the same angle and the same speed, and to the controller's horror, they looked out the window and literally saw the plane was lowering its landing gear. Like, clearly they are going to attempt to land, even though this looks so dangerous. And so the controller, in a bit of a panic, radios again up to the captain and says, "Hey, you're still coming in too fast, too steep of an angle, abort the landing." But again, the captain did not respond. What Captain Alexander had said to Gennady when he said, "Hey, can I ask you something?" was, "Hey, do you want to make a bet that I can land this plane blind?" And Gennady, who was also very bored, thought, "You know what? That's a great idea. Let's do it." And so the two pilots lowered all the shades inside of the cockpit, blocking all of the windows, so Captain Alexander literally can't see anything except for his instruments. And then Captain Alexander attempted to land the plane.
And when the air traffic controller began calling up to Captain Alexander saying, "You're going too fast, your angle's wrong," Captain Alexander was sure he could pull it off, and so he totally ignored the controller and went for the runway. And when he hit the runway, he was going too fast at too steep of an angle, and so it broke off the landing gear, the plane skidded all the way down the runway, and then flipped over and caught on fire. Out of the 94 people who were on board that plane, 70 would perish, including the co-pilot Gennady Zernov. As for Captain Alexander, who orchestrated this whole tragedy, well, he actually survived, and he was sentenced to 15 years in prison. The next and final story of today's episode is called Baltic Fleet.
Around the turn of the 20th century, Russia and Japan got into a dispute over who should be in control of Korea and China. Looking to avoid an armed conflict, the Japanese sent the Russians a deal that came with reasonable concessions on both sides. But the Russians didn't like it, they rejected the deal, and they countered with a pretty unreasonable deal that came with lots of concessions for Japan and not so many for Russia. And so Japan rejected that deal and then promptly launched a devastating surprise attack on the Russian Navy stationed at Fort Arthur in China. This attack would officially start the one-year-long Russo-Japanese War. The Russians knew they would need to send a replacement naval fleet up to Fort Arthur to reclaim it from the Japanese, but unfortunately, the attack at Fort Arthur had totally wiped out all of Russia's best sailors and all their best ships, putting Russia at a major disadvantage to start this war. And so as Russians are wondering what they're going to do next, the Russian Emperor, Tsar Nicholas II, authorizes an unbelievable mission. He orders the Russian Baltic Fleet to set sail from their harbor in northern Europe and sail 18,000 miles around the world to Japan, where they will defeat the Japanese and then reclaim Fort Arthur. The fact that none of the Baltic Fleet ships were designed to sail that far of a distance, or that there were literally 0 refueling points along their massive projected path, was considered largely inconsequential and ignored. What was also considered inconsequential was how absurdly unqualified the Baltic crew was. The sailors were mostly illiterate peasants that did not grow up on the coasts, and so they showed up for military training with no seafaring skills. And then after their military training, they still had no seafaring skills because the Baltic Fleet's harbor was frozen solid almost year-round. But the Tsar believed the man he had put in charge of this crew, Admiral Rozhestvensky, would make up for their deficiencies. And this belief was not unwarranted. Admiral Rozhestvensky was the best Russian officer that had not been killed in that Japan surprise attack. He had significant combat experience, and he had a wickedly bad temper. He didn't care who you were. If you were doing something he didn't like, he was going to beat the crap out of you. Literally. And when he was told he was going to be in charge of this fairly inexperienced crew, he was certain his rough style would whip these Baltic boys into shape, and they would be very successful. But when he laid eyes on the Baltic Fleet, he realized this was going to be a little bit more challenging than he realized. In addition to being less than satisfied with his fighting crew, he was equally dissatisfied with the 2 senior officers that were assigned to be his direct support. And he immediately gave them nicknames, and he would only refer to them by their nicknames, right to their face. The first one was the Manure Sack, and the other was a vast empty space. As for the Baltic Fleet's 45 ships, they were terrible. Because this unit never went out on the ocean because their harbor was always frozen, Russia didn't waste their good ships on them. So all they had were really old, obsolete warships and then non-military ships like ferries and yachts that they just slapped random guns onto. They also had ships that the Baltic Fleet crew enthusiastically called futuristic, which were these ships that came out of Russia briefly copying French engineering, which involved these crazy top-heavy ships that sat so low in the water that their lowest rung of weapons, their cannons that poked out the windows at the bottom of the ship, They didn't work because they sat under the water permanently. But regardless of their shortfalls, the Baltic Fleet was what Rojesvenski had been dealt, and so he had to just get them moving if they were going to win the war. And so on October 16th, 1904, Admiral Rojesvenski ordered all of his men to take their positions in all of their ships, and they set sail. And immediately, 30 seconds into their trip, the lead ship ran aground, and another ship lost its anchor, even though it should not have been casting its anchor to begin with. And so while one ship is trying to refloat, and the other is trying to find its anchor in the ocean, a third ship comes along and broadsides a fourth ship. And it does so much damage to this fourth ship, that ship had to go back home. But once they overcame these initial obstacles, the Baltic Fleet that now numbered 44 ships made it out of the harbor without any more issues and then set sail for the narrow waters between Denmark and Sweden. As they drew closer, Manursak informed Rojesvenski that there might be an issue, that he had heard rumblings amongst the crew that they believed Japanese torpedo boats were stationed off the coast of Denmark waiting for them to get there. Rojesvenski told Manursak that that was impossible. The Japanese torpedo boats did not have the capabilities to sail 18,000 miles to Denmark, and even if they did have the ability to do that, they could not have gotten there in such a short period of time. But Manursak told Rojesvenski that unfortunately, even though logically that makes sense, this rumor had spread all across the crew. And so Rojesvenski began sending out messages to all the other ships, telling them there are no Japanese torpedo boats waiting for us off the coast of Denmark. Everybody just needs to calm down. And these messages did appear to work at first, because eventually another rumor began to circulate, one that Rojesvenski was not really aware of as it was happening, and that was that the crew began to believe there was a huge minefield underneath them. Everywhere they went, there was a minefield. And everybody got so worked up about it that it made its way back to a lot of the captains actually piloting the different ships. And at some point, the pilots just began doing these evasive maneuvers, and Rojesvenski's looking around wondering what they're doing, and they began crashing into each other, trying to avoid this minefield. When Rojesvenski finally figured out what was going on, he sent out even more messages telling them that there's no minefield under us. It's totally safe. Everybody just needs to calm down. And so it took Rojesvenski going out on deck and firing shots into the air to finally get people to stop believing they were on top of a minefield. But just a couple of hours later, after Rojesvenski had gone back up to the bridge and was just looking out, surveying his fleet as they carried on towards Denmark and Sweden, when all of a sudden, towards the very front of his fleet, he heard this unbelievable barrage of cannon fire. One of his own ships was engaging something out in front of the fleet. But Rojesvenski was too far away to see what it was, and then a message came through from the attacking ship, whose name was Kamchatka, and they said they were surrounded on all sides by at least 8 Japanese torpedo boats. And so Rojesvenski runs out onto the deck, looking out towards the horizon, expecting to see these 8 Japanese ships, but he doesn't. And then all of a sudden, the shooting just completely stops, and it's silent. And then Rojesvenski notices on his right side a small little fishing boat is making its way right up alongside his. It would turn out Kamchatka, the attacking ship, had confused this little unarmed Russian fishing ship with 8 Japanese torpedo boats and had opened fire. But luckily, even though they fired hundreds and hundreds of rounds at this little boat, none of them hit the boat, and so the fishermen were fine, and the fishermen had actually been sent to the boat, specifically by Tsar Nicholas II, to tell Rojesvenski that he had been promoted. And so Rojesvenski apologizes to the fishermen for having shot at them hundreds and hundreds of times, and they said it was okay, and the fishermen carried on. After Rojesvenski chewed out the crew of the Kamchatka, the rest of the Baltic fleet gathered up, and they continued towards the narrow waters between Denmark and Sweden. When they got close, a Danish resupply ship came out to meet them to give them fuel and food and water, and the Baltic fleet mistook them for a Japanese torpedo boat, causing them to ram them repeatedly. And then they realized their mistake, but at that point they had done severe damage to the resupply ship, who had to immediately turn around and go back to shore. After that, the Baltic fleet did manage to get past Denmark and Sweden, and they made it out to the North Sea. but as soon as they got out there, there was trouble. One of the captains of the ships that was towards the front of the Baltic Fleet's formation spotted 4 Japanese torpedo boats coming right at them. And so this ship, along with 6 others, immediately just began engaging these 4 ships with everything they had. Cannons, big guns, small guns, everything. It was absolute chaos from the front of this formation. And the amount of gunfire that was going off towards the front caused the rest of the ships that were not part of the attack to begin to panic. And the other ship captains began ramming into each other to try to get away from this attack. And so while that's going on, all the crew members on all the ships begin drawing their swords and running around expecting the Japanese to board them at any moment. And the others that did not draw their swords put on life jackets and laid down on their back on the deck of the ship, believing that was procedure for how to survive a sinking ship. And so for the next 20 minutes, it was just continuous gunfire coming from the front of their formation. One of the attacking ships sent a message back to Rojesvenski that said they had been hit by a torpedo and they were taking heavy fire and it was just absolute bedlam up there. And then all of a sudden, it just totally stopped. And when the smoke cleared, Rojesvenski and his ship had been able to maneuver up a little bit closer and they could see what they were shooting at. And it would turn out, once again, it was a case of mistaken identity. They were not being attacked by Japanese torpedo boats. They had spotted 4 small British fishing boats. And in the chaos of the gunfight, the Baltic Fleet had inadvertently begun to fire at each other, killing several crew members and badly damaging their ships in the process. As for the British fishermen, only one of their boats actually sunk, despite the fact that the Baltic Fleet had fired thousands and thousands of rounds at them, and they had been stationary the entire time. The Russian Tsar immediately apologized to Britain, but the British media went crazy and the British people called for war, believing that this type of attack could not possibly be an accident. But Russian diplomats leveled with the British and said, no, this really was an accident. And eventually they convinced them, avoiding starting yet another war. Rojesvenski and his Baltic fleet were allowed to continue in their journey, and after a couple of weeks, they were getting close to Africa when one of his ships, the Kamchatka, the same ship that believed they were surrounded by 8 Japanese torpedo boats, they got separated from the main fleet and got lost. And so Rojesvenski and the other officers did what they could to try to locate them, but nobody had seen where they went, and there wasn't great technology to try to locate them, and so unfortunately, Rojesvenski and the Baltic fleet just had to continue on and hope that at some point the lost ship would find them again. A few days later, the main body arrived in Tangier, and lo and behold, Kamchatka showed up. And they informed Rojesvenski that they had gotten lost, and they didn't really have a good answer for that. But once they were lost, they managed to engage 3 separate Japanese torpedo boats. But it would turn out they were not Japanese torpedo boats. They were in fact a German, a Swedish, and a French fishing boat. But none of Kamchatka's rounds actually impacted any of the 3 vessels, and so 3 more wars were averted. And so now that Rojesvenski had his lost ship back, he gathered up his full Baltic fleet, and they left Tangier. But on their way out, one of the ships managed to cut the underwater telegraph line to Tangier, cutting off Tangier's communication with Europe for the next 4 days. By now, the Baltic fleet was very low on coal, but they had a planned rendezvous with a German resupply ship off the coast of West Africa. When they got there, the crew decided they didn't want to do another resupply later on, and so let's just take double coal this time. And so they hauled all this extra coal onto their ships despite not having a place for it, and so naturally they began throwing it in the halls and in their bedrooms and basically anywhere there was space. And what that did is it led to a fine layer of coal dust all over everything in the ship. And that, combined with the intense humidity off the coast of Africa, led to this black coal gunk getting trapped inside of all of the sailors' lungs, which began killing several of them. A couple weeks later, as they rounded the southern tip of Africa, it finally rained on them, washing away a lot of that coal dust on their ships, which was a big relief. But the rain turned into a pretty bad storm, and so Rojesvenski decided he just wanted all of his ships to call in and say they were okay. And so one by one, each of the ships were told to message him saying the words, "We are okay." And so one by one, each of the ships did this until it got to Kamchatka's turn. And they accidentally sent the message, "Do you see Japanese torpedo boats?" And of course, this message spread like wildfire across the entire crew, which led to mass hysteria, and Rozhdestvensky's trying to send out messages to say, no, there's no Japanese torpedo boats, but it's too late. The other captains are panicking, and they're ramming into each other and firing blindly into the wind. From that point forward, every night, Rozhdestvensky would go up onto the bow of his ship, and he would scream obscenities at Kamchatka. When the Baltic Fleet finally made it to Madagascar, the morale amongst the crew was very low. And so when they docked in Madagascar, the crew decided it would be a good idea to boost their morale by buying some pets to bring back on board the ship with them. And the pets they decided to bring back were crocodiles and poisonous snakes. When their handlers smuggled them back on board their ship, they immediately escaped down into the bowels of the ship. When they went looking for them, they couldn't find them because the ships were in such bad shape. There were all sorts of cracks and holes all over the interior for these animals to escape to. And so the men just had to accept there were very dangerous predators just living on their ship with them. And so most men were unable to sleep at night in fear of being attacked by these animals, which led a number of them to go for real insane. And so the pets idea didn't really boost morale amongst the Baltic Fleet, and so one of the officers decided he would take another crack at boosting spirits. And so he went to a vendor in Madagascar, and he purchased 2,000 of their finest cigarettes to bring back on board. So he brings them back on board, he hands them all out, and everyone's so thankful. But it turns out those cigarettes were laced with enormous amounts of opium, which led to hundreds of the crew members becoming hopelessly addicted to opium. Also in Madagascar, the sailors picked up dozens of diseases that began wiping them out in droves. During one funeral for a crew member, the Kamchatka asked if they could fire a salute with blank rounds. They were given permission, but they accidentally fired live rounds into the ship right next to them. When Rozhdestvensky and the rest of the Baltic Fleet finally left Madagascar, their only refrigerator on board one of their ships broke, which spoiled all of their meat, tons and tons of meat. And so they began throwing it overboard, which attracted hundreds and hundreds of sharks, which circled their ships for the rest of their journey. Rozhdestvensky desperately wanted to find a way to somehow train the remainder of the Baltic Fleet how to be somewhat militarily competent. And so he decided he would make them all do target practice because that had been a big issue on this trip so far. And so he had one ship attach a long line that was connected to a target in the water, and that ship would pull the target along, and the other ships would take shots at the target. And so all of the ships on Rozhdestvensky's call began firing at this target, and after thousands and thousands of rounds, they didn't hit the target once. However, they managed to continuously shoot the ship that was pulling the target. For Rozhdestvensky, this was the final straw. He felt like he could do absolutely nothing to make the Baltic Fleet an actual military force. And so he sent a message back to the Tsar and said, you gotta replace me. I need to resign and somebody else needs to come in and take over. And the Tsar said, no, this is your fleet. And so begrudgingly, Rozhdestvensky continued on leading the Baltic Fleet until they finally, after 7 total months on the sea, were within striking distance of their target in Japan. The night before, as they prepared for their attack, they went into stealth mode where all the ships killed all of their lights, so they're totally dark, with the exception of their hospital ship. That kept their lights on. This was considered a rule of war at the time, which both sides abided by. And so while the Baltic Fleet was sitting out in the waters outside of Japan, a small fishing boat began coming towards them. Now, the fishing boat could only see the lit-up hospital ship. They could not see the 43 other darkened ships. And so a crew member on board this hospital ship came up to the railing, and he recognized the fishing boat was actually a Russian fishing boat. And so he waved them down, and when the Russian fishermen came outside, the crew member told him, you gotta stop, because there's 43 ships behind me that have their lights off. Do not go this way, go around. And so the Russian fisherman thanked him and turned around and went on his merry way. Except that wasn't a Russian fisherman, it was a Japanese sailor on board a Japanese torpedo boat. And now they knew exactly where the Baltic Fleet was. And so that night, the Japanese Navy completely surrounded the Baltic Fleet, and then the next day at daybreak, they launched their attack. It was called the Battle of Tsushima, and it was obscenely lopsided. The Japanese Navy completely wiped out the Baltic Fleet, killing 4,000 of their crew members and capturing 7,300 others, which included Rojesvenski, who had been badly wounded in the battle, but he would survive. In contrast, the Japanese only had 100 casualties. This victory for Japan really marked the end of the war for Russia, and shortly after the Battle of Tsushima, the Russians agreed to surrender.
Thank you for listening to the Mrballen podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts, not just this one, but also Mrballen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, and Runful. Just search for Ballen Studios on any podcast platform, and you'll find all of them. If you want to watch hundreds more strange, dark, and mysterious stories, just head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called